Session, and we are going to talk about differential risk perceptions and coping strategies. So we start with Jacqueline Meijer-Irons. Okay, so over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll echo the sentiments of several other presenters in thanking the conference organizers for putting together this really interesting series of sessions, and also for inviting me to present some of my work. So the title of my paper, Who Perceives What? A Demographic Analysis of Environmental Perception in Rural Thailand, may change a bit, and depending on input from you, I might think a little bit more about how I model some of these things. But I wanted to present some of my preliminary analysis. This is part of my larger dissertation project, so I'm very much interested in your feedback and suggestions for improvement. Oh, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington in Seattle. So just briefly, to give you an overview rather than just launching into my presentation, I'll start with an introduction and give you a little bit of a sense of what motivates my research, introduce my research question, and then I'm just going to very briefly touch on the literature review. I obviously expand quite a bit in my paper. I'll introduce my data and methods, discuss my very preliminary results, and then also some thoughts that I have on further research, and then obviously provide opportunity for questions. So this introductory slide is blank. I had a picture in it, and it didn't show up as well as I thought, but it was a picture of me doing some field work last year around this time in northeast Thailand. I've had a really wonderful opportunity to work with my dissertation advisor, Professor Sarah Curran, on a fairly extensive panel study in Nong Rang, Thailand, where we're looking at the impacts of climate on outmigration in the region. And one of the things that I thought as I stood in the middle of these rice paddies taking pictures for a land use map that we were putting together was, wouldn't it be great if these data that we're analyzing included some measure of how people who rely on natural resources for their livelihoods actually conceive of the environment. I was making lots of assumptions as a researcher from cold, rainy Seattle about what drought means to people, and so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? And unfortunately, the Nong Rang data did not provide that with information, so I had to look a bit further afield. Which leads to my research questions, which I've hinted already at, and particularly, what do people say when you ask them about risks? For modeling a lot of the research that looks at the impacts of the environment typically rely on objective physical measures, and so I was interested in understanding if you were to combine these objective physical measures with some sort of a vulnerability assessment or personal perception of the environment, how does that look? And then, because I'm interested in this issue of demographic differentials and vulnerability, which happens to also be conveniently the topic of this conference, I was interested in the question, how do household demographic characteristics influence whether a household reports the environment as a threat to their livelihoods? And in the paper, I talk a little bit more about how I rely on the sustainable livelihoods framework to inform some of my variable selection, because I'm particularly interested in understanding how access to a suite of assets, suite of capital forms of capital might condition a vulnerability response. So very briefly, after thinking a bit about how some of my research questions, I did what any researcher does, of course, and I appealed to the literature. And what I found was that although the vulnerability literature really makes a push for including subjective perceptions in a broader discussion of vulnerability, a few empirical studies, that at least that I could find, actually model household assessments of risk as a dependent variable. And that was what I was interested in exploring a bit more. Those studies that I did find are mostly cross-sectional studies, and so while they did give a hint at some spatial variability across the time period of survey, they didn't really go into a greater longitudinal depth that I thought could be interesting in understanding how risk perceptions might be updated over time. The other issue that I found in literature, in particular because I was interested in this Thai context, was that most of the literature is focused on Africa. So I was interested in understanding how the factors that might impact household assessments in the context of Africa may differ or mirror some similar characteristics in the Thai context. And one thing that I did find that I mentioned very briefly is that heterogeneity risk assessments in these few studies that I have found was very much evident. So even in a seemingly homogeneous landscape, and several presenters have already touched on this, there is considerable variation in terms of who is assessing, who is declaring a risk, and then what types of risks they're assessing. And finally, one of the studies that influenced quite a bit of my thinking, Barrett et al. Study in 2001, looks at pastoralists in East Africa. And in thinking about some of the heterogeneity and risk assessments that these researchers discovered, they kind of thought a little bit about what that might mean for future research. And one of the things that they talked about, and again, these are concepts that we've already touched on a bit, is that risk assessments are multifaceted. If you ask somebody what risk means to them, it's not a simple answer. It's quite often a combination of the exposure that they find themselves under, the perception, how they perceive the exposure that they're exposed to, and then also their ability, either as an individual or as a household, to mitigate ex ante or cope ex post. And so I'm trying to explore a little bit of this in my own research. And then finally, there's some evidence, at least from this small literature, that community level risks might outweigh household level risks, at least when people are asked to assess risks to their livelihoods. For example, in a paper also looking at East Africa, the researchers found that drought was more often mentioned than, say, a death in the household. So the way that people think about risk and prioritize risk in their rankings differs depending on the level that you're looking at. And finally, something that was touched on, and I try to address it a bit in my paper, but I think I could do a little bit better, and I'll talk about that, is this concept of social learning. So could the assessments of other people in your village or community influence your own risks, own assessments of risk? And then I just want to say, for these papers that I looked at, the measures were prospective risk assessments. Unfortunately, I don't have access to prospective risk assessments. The data that I rely on are retrospective, so there may be some differences in terms of conclusions that I can make from that. So moving on to Thailand, and why Thailand is of interest to me in particular. One, I think that there's a considerable gap in the literature in terms of understanding this concept of risk assessment in Southeast Asia, and I think that there's some really interesting opportunities for exploring these concepts in the Thai context. And as you know, under proposed climate scenarios, very few areas are spared. In Thailand in particular, there's some evidence of the patterns already changing. One is that the number of rainy days has decreased in the past 50 years, and the mean annual temperature has increased by 1 degree Celsius between 1981 and 2009, which is the paper that I looked at most recently. And this has particular implications for rice crops, which are a significant source of livelihood for a number of rural households in Thailand. Rice crops have been found to be particularly sensitive to climate change. That is, if the onset of rain event or duration of rain event changes, this can have significant implications for crop outputs. Rain-fed irrigation is quite common, as in many rural households within the developing world. And finally, there's some evidence, and I don't think I need to convince you of this, that more vulnerable farmers may not be able to adapt even under sort of conservative emission scenarios. And so there's some policy implications here as well. So just to touch on, how am I doing on time? Good. Okay. Okay, 10 minutes. Okay, so just to touch very briefly on the social data that I am using for my paper. The Townsend Thai data is a unique cross-sectional retrospective paneled data set that has been going on annually since 1997, and it surveys, in the particular section of the survey that I'm interested in, are 4 provinces in northeast and central Thailand. The households are located across 14 districts in these 2 provinces. Within these districts, 64 villages are surveyed, randomly sampled, and 16 households per village are randomly sampled, for a total of approximately 960 households that are surveyed every year, and they do have replacement for when households drop out. Because of the way that I was thinking of the data, I wasn't able, there were some missing variables that restricted my final sample size to 9,576 household years. And I restrict for this survey I'm sorry, for this analysis, my data from 1997 to 2006, although data is still being collected, and that is just sort of an artifact of the environmental data that I use. And essentially, the survey asks just a gazillion questions, but the questions that I'm particularly interested in are the risk response modules, where respondents, household respondents, are asked to compare income in T-1 to income in T-2, and to ask which income year was worse. And those respondents who responded that T-1, so the year immediately prior to the survey collection, were prompted to answer why. And I construct my dependent variable based on this. And I'm certainly open to some suggestions about how to conceptualize this further. But for now, I restrict my dependent variable as households who attribute a bad year to not enough rainfall. And as you can see here, there's quite a number of possible responses. And out of my 9,576 household years, about half indicated that the year immediately prior to the survey collection was a bad income year. And there are a number of possible reasons. And for now, I'm restricted to not enough rainfall, but in doing some more thinking, I want to go back and explore flooding and pest destroy crop and other potential environmental variables, because I think that I may have some biased estimates if I don't include those. Finally, for my data, environmental data, I had mentioned that I was interested in understanding how objective data might play a role in perceptions. And so, unfortunately, through my data use agreement with the Townsend Thai Data Project, I wasn't able to obtain rainfall data that they collect, which would have been lovely. So I searched out for a somewhat suitable rainfall substitute, and I focused on NDVI, which is Normalized Differenced Vegetation Index, which measures the plant vigor on the ground. It's a remote sense data product, and it has been found to be pretty correlated with rainfall, so I'm somewhat confident in the ability to use that as a proxy. The particular data product that I use is collected between 1982 and 2006, and the spatial resolution is 8 by 8 kilometers, so it's a fairly coarse resolution, but I trade that off for some temporal resolution. And I'm only able to identify households to the district level, so I aggregate my NDVI variable to create a annual district level measure of NDVI, and then I standardize this to indicate whether a district is above or below a normal period. And just very briefly to illustrate what that means, 1998 was a particularly droughty year, so you can see that these districts tend to be below average in terms of their NDVI, or another way to think about it is below average in terms of plant vigor and rainfall. And then 2000, which is a fairly wet year, you can see most, with some outliers, or one outlier, were above average. And so I do this for each year. I'll go through this somewhat quickly. So some control variables that and these are very preliminary control variables. I was interested in understanding how the characteristics of the household head might have what effect these characteristics have on my outcome variable, which is households that attribute a bad income year to not enough rainfall. So I look at some standard characteristics: age, sex, level of education. And then I am interested in moving a bit beyond the dependency ratio and looking at household composition variables according to age and gender, to see if younger men versus older men, and younger women versus older women within a household, the number of them within a household may have an impact on how households consider the environment. Okay, and then I include some district level environmental variables. So just very briefly, I'll present my findings. In terms of the household head characteristics, I find that age is significant, but it has a very small odds ratio of increasing the likelihood of a household reporting the environment as a threat to livelihoods, and that has it decreases when you square it, so it seems that it peaks to a point and then declines. And then I didn't mention this, but I created a categorical variables to indicate the sort of concentration of occupations within the household and how concentrated they are in agriculture. And I'd particularly be interested in some thoughts about this variable. I also create an income quintile with the referent being the lowest income quintile to see how that influences a household's response, and it performs in the way that you might expect with richer households having a decreased likelihood of reporting the environment as a threat. And then looking at household composition, the only two significant factors were a number of females between the ages of 25, I'm sorry, that should say 59, that's a typo, and then the number of elders within the household. And I think that may have something to do with the differential roles of men and women within the household. Women may be more tied to the household for child rearing and agricultural activities. And that could influence how a household considers the environment. And finally, I include the controls for the below average and above average NDVI. So that's looking at my objective environmental variables, and they perform in the way that I would suspect. That is, a drier year is going to increase the likelihood that a household will report the environment as a threat. And then I used the question, was this year bad for others in the village? So this is the respondent's perception of how other people within the village are experiencing their income year, and that was highly significant. And then finally, I include some measures for household sharing of resources and institutional membership, and they weren't significant. And I think I need to rethink about how I've conceptualized those two variables, because I think there might be a little bit more going on there. Okay, so I mentioned my discussion of my results, and I just want to point out, this is my last slide, some future research and next steps that I've already been thinking about. One is that I'd like to incorporate, because I have the data, a wealth asset index to get at non-income wealth within a household and see how that might impact people's views on the environment. I'd also am interested, because I'm not the occupational variable, I think based on my outcome, I wasn't getting very much from that additional information from that variable. I've considered breaking that occupational variable up by gender, and then also looking at a little bit more refined agricultural occupation, because I can do that, whether it's rice farming or other farming. And then I mentioned already, I've thinking about expanding my dependent variable to include all responses related to environmental factors, and then potentially also just all vulnerability, all reasons that people have given, and thinking about creating categories for that. And then finally, I didn't include this, and I think this is one of the strengths of using longitudinal data that came to me late at night, and that is that investigating a prior response of the environment as a threat to the household, and see how that might help me understand whether or not people are more likely or less likely to report the environment. And I think that could go either way. It could be that repeated exposure to the environment may actually dampen somebody's consideration of the environment as a threat, or it could increase the likelihood, and that some people might just always sort of respond that droughty conditions were a threat to the household. And just my last slide, I just would like, of course, to acknowledge the various funding sources that have gotten me this far in graduate school, and also to the conference today. So, any questions?
Thank you very much. Okay, so questions or comments from the floor? Yes.
We often in demography talk about asset indicators, and of course there's a little cottage industry of studies. One of the things that is very seldom examined is whether these are indeed items that function as assets, in the sense that in times of stress they are sold or otherwise transferred for some other item of value. And of course, if you're looking at a rural setting, it may be that many households are subject to the same direction of stress at the same time, even if not necessarily the same strength of the stressor. And so that could constrain whether an asset in principle is in fact sellable, right, in a difficult year. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about what is the right role, the way of thinking about assets in a context like this.
Should we collect a few?
Okay, yeah, you prefer that? Okay. Yeah.
Very interesting research, Jacqueline. I think this is the second time I listened to it. Not complete the same, right? And I particularly interested in your your analysis using look at the household characteristics, and you look at the size, particularly the composition of age structure. Right? Do you also consider to look at the household structure in terms of generational relationship, and also the when you talk about occupation, concentration of occupation, could you elaborate a bit? What are you really talking about? Do you consider the possibility of migration, and particularly when the households try to diversify the income and diversify the risks, and migration is always the one that used as a means of reduce the risk increase in income sources. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a methodological comment or maybe a piece of advice. You have a data set which is organized at the household level. You're interested in a variable which is at the district level, right? Your NDVI. Now, when you're estimating your model, in order to get the most efficient estimates, in principle you should account for fixed effects at the district level, right? Now that would imply that you're losing all your interesting, the story that you're trying to tell. So you could do it in two steps, in which you, first of all, get more precise quantitative estimates using fixed effects at the district level, and then you regress those fixed effects on your NDVI variable and eventually other GANs, which would help you also understand how the quantitative effect looks like, because what you are estimating there is a bit fishy in terms of, not in terms of the qualitative effect, probably you're going to find the same, but in terms of giving that tag, in terms of by how much the odds change, I would be a bit careful before you have estimated it with, or until you have estimated it with fixed effects, and then have a look at how the fixed effects correlate with those things, with the NDVI.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I like how you actually explain how you got to your preliminary findings in a very robust way. When I saw the title of your presentation, I was expecting something much more qualitative, and I'm not saying that qualitative is better than quantitative or vice versa. Just what I expected based on the title, and then. I'm just thinking, did you also analyze these almost 10,000 short explanations of people why last year was a good year or a bad year? I guess 5,000, right, that were said a bad year. Will you include such more qualitative analysis also in your book? And what are maybe some findings that you have seen if you did that already?
More questions?
Okay. So I guess I'll start with Case, with your comment, because that was sort of what I was hinting at the beginning, that my title should probably change. There is some qualitative within they are asked. So the questions that are posed, there are pre-populated responses that are possible, but there is also the possibility of a sort of non-prompted response. Unfortunately, there aren't many non-prompted responses for me to analyze, but I think sort of setting the context of why I was interested in this and being in the field, I think ultimately when I'm running my own shop, if you will, I would love to go out and do qualitative work, because I think that there are so many questions that I couldn't ask of these data. For example, I can't ask, what do you mean by not enough rainfall? Is it onset? Is it quantity? Is it, what is it? So I think there are a lot of follow-up questions that these point at that I can't get at with this particular data set. So, but I certainly think there's a lot of room for qualitative exploration of these assessments. Let's see, the question that you had, Mark, about, so I have to be honest that I haven't done a lot of thinking yet about the asset index, and so I would love to have some thoughts about how maybe what you were thinking about with that question. We can certainly talk afterwards, because the initial sort of examining the data, I thought, oh, this is great. They have this really robust way of collecting income, which is oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes why these wealth indices are used in place of sort of more sketchy income. And so only later did I think, well, you know, which may seem common sense, but sometimes you're so in your head about these things. Wouldn't it be interesting to model these things together? Because income is one aspect of what people have, but of course, the ability to collect assets and also to sell, which they do ask in the survey, did you acquire or sell in the last 12 months? So there is some room for me to explore that a bit more. Let's see. You asked, they went about household structure and generational. I think that perhaps didn't present it very well, or maybe didn't create my variables as well as I could have, but that's a little bit more of what I'm going towards in thinking about that, is thinking about life course of the household. And is there something about the composition of younger households versus older households that might give some hint at how I might explain differential assessment of risk, or in particularly environmental risk.
I'm more talking about, you know, how many generations are presented with the family.
Oh, I see. I see. I'd have, so the sort of one downside of this data set is that the household roster isn't as complete as it could be, in terms of looking at that a little bit in finer detail. So I think that might be something for a future data set that I don't know that I can necessarily, unless I'm not understanding your question, that I can necessarily get at with the way that these data are collected. And then the question you asked if I could elaborate the question of thinking about occupation and migration. So my next paper in my dissertation actually looks more closely at this issue of migration, and I'm keeping it separate for a number of reasons, but I was a little bit concerned about reverse causality if I included migration in this measure, included the migration as an independent variable to predict vulnerability, and then turn around and use it the other way for a second paper. But I'm certainly interested in this idea of migration as an adaptation response. And thinking about the concentration of agriculture within the households, I was thinking along those lines of households that are more concentrated in agriculture may have less flexibility in terms of their ability to earn off-farm income. And then the other thing that, kind of going back to this idea of qualitative research, there is a follow-up question, and that is, what did you do to adapt? And so very few people actually indicated that migration was an adaptation response, although about a quarter of households indicate that they have a migrant either leaving or returning to the household. So it's definitely, there's something to be explored there about how people think about migration in terms of a response to a stated vulnerability, and then how migration might actually be employed within these households to as an adaptation response. And I think those are all the questions. Oh, and I would love to talk with you a little bit more about thinking about this. I do have a village level fixed effect, but I think thinking about it also at the district level would be definitely worth exploring. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. We are doing very well in terms of time. Okay. All right. Thank you. So the next presenter is Chandrashekhar. Okay.
Good afternoon to everyone. Before I start, I must thank the organizers. The title of my presentation is Livelihood Strategies in Response to Drought and its socio-economic determinants in Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh is a state in India, and the co-author for this work is Bornali Dutta, and we both are research scholars in International Institute for Population Sciences, Mumbai. I would first like to define drought. There is one natural climate change, and because of this natural climate change, precipitation deficiency occurs. Precipitation deficiency in terms of amount, in terms of intensity, and in terms of timing, which is particularly delay in rainfall. And the second thing which is associated with it is that there is high temperature along with high wind flow, and because of this there is low relative humidity in the environment, coupled with greater sunshine. These things actually less precipitation causes reduced infiltration to the groundwater, and high temperature and all these things increases the evapotranspiration, and these things collectively called as meteorological drought. This meteorological drought leads to soil water deficiency. Actually, soil water deficiency causes plants stress to plant because of less water, and because of less water there is reduced biomass. This leads to reduced crop yield, and this is called agricultural drought because there is reduction in crop yield. Another thing that soil water deficiency does is that it reduces the stream flow. Therefore, there is reduction in the content of the water in reservoir as well as lakes and ponds. This is called hydrological drought. This drought actually causes lots of suffering to the affected areas, and there are economic impact of the drought. There is social impact of the drought, and of course there is environmental impact of the drought. And these impacts causes people to adapt for certain strategies, and that is why it is livelihood strategy. I have deliberately used the word livelihood strategy here because the masses in Andhra Pradesh, actually they are particularly rural masses, and they are primarily dependent upon agriculture. If their standing crop dies, their livelihood get affected, and that is why I have used their livelihood strategies. There is one other than this definitional problem, the definition, there is socio-economic considerations of drought also. There is a sequence of event that occurs during drought. That is, first is that the standing crops dies because of drought. This leads to unemployment, then again decrease in income. It leads to erosion of the household assets, and this causes indebtedness, then poor nutrition, worsening of living condition, which decreases the risk absorptive capacity of the households. And frequent droughts increases the vulnerability of the poor to another drought. This is the map of the state. The darker shade shows the drought prone area, which has historically been considered as the drought prone area for the last 50 years. And this map has been drawn with the help of World Bank report 2010. I have gone through some of the literature. One literature by Pandey and Ackerman, they said that they work in Rajasthan. There is another drought prone area in India. They said that migration is the most important coping strategy, and again they further said that in the event of severe drought, children are dropped out from the school to support the household work. And cattle is supposed to be one of the important household asset. They during the event of severe drought, they found that the cattle are being sold. This is one of the important study by Erickson and some others. They have found that coping strategy is very dynamic and social process, and the coping strategy differs according to time and location. And they also concluded that no single strategy was there in Tanzania and Kenya as a drought coping mechanism for drought, but there are multiple complementary activities. Another study by Khera in 2009, she has found that credit is one of the important factor to sort out the tiding over the shortage that occur during the time of drought. And she also found that the households which are poor and which are the socio-economically in the lower strata of the society, they are eating less and skipping meals during the event of drought. Why this study is important? Because drought, after each 2 to 3 years, millions of people are affected in that particular state, and there is persistent and aggravated miseries, because earlier studies have found that the interval between one drought to another drought was around 3 to 5 years. 4 to 5 years, but now for the last 10 to 15 years, it has been seen that the difference has been reduced by around 1.5 year, 1 year to 1.5 year. So now it is after each 2 to 2.5 years, there is one event of drought. And we have seen that the livelihood strategy is a dynamic process. It changes according to location and time. And one important thing that social scientists in general and demographers in particular are relatively have been relatively less explored the event of this drought and its impact on human population. Therefore, I tried to explore this phenomena. These are some of the research questions. First, the distribution of drought affected households, and what are the livelihood strategies of the drought victim they adopt to, and the third one is that what are the factors that determine the prime livelihood strategies in Andhra Pradesh. I have formulated some of the objectives. First is that to find out the drought affected victims. with respect to several characteristics. And second is to explore the livelihood strategies of drought victim. What are the livelihood strategies they adapt to during the time of drought? And the third one is to identify factors that affect the livelihood strategy. I have formulated some of the hypotheses. The first one is that there is no drought affected household in the village, that is the null hypothesis. Second one is the use of credit is not the livelihood strategies of drought victims. And third is eating less by the household members is not an approach to fight the drought. And working more is not a practice of drought victims. For this study, I have borrowed the data from Young Life study. This is a study being conducted in 4 countries, namely Ethiopia, Peru, Vietnam, and India. In India, it is being conducted in Andhra Pradesh, the state of Andhra Pradesh. This study has actually been the main objective of this study is for identify childhood poverty, but along with this there is very rich source of information regarding natural events, and drought has been also questions regarding drought has also been asked in the study. And there is the question is asked, like, for the last 4 years how many droughts have hit, and the information has been sought for the most recent drought. And several socio-economic and community characteristics are also been given in the data set. And the question has also been asked about what is the strategy that you adapt for during the event of drought. Please arrange according to order of first, second, third, like that. Based on that, there are multiple responses, around 16 responses I found, and in all those 16 responses I have clubbed into 5. The first one is used credit, insurance and savings, which is related to the economy of the household. And the second is eating less, buying less and working more, which is related to the nutritional aspects of the household members. And the third is migrated to work, which I have found in the literature that during the event of drought people migrate from rural areas to urban areas. And the fourth one is that help from government, NGOs and community, whether they have received any kind of help from government, NGO and community during the event of drought. And rest I have clubbed into others. So this is the dependent variable, 4 different dependent variables. For demarcating the poor and non-poor households, I have computed that principal component analysis based on 16 household assets. So bivariate and multivariate. Bivariate and multivariate analysis I did. Here in the first equation, YC is the use of credit, saving and insurances, and XI is the set of independent variables. Similarly, YW is the eating less, working more and buying less, and similarly XI is the same set of independent variables. The study found that around 28% of the households are affected by drought for the most recent drought. This information is for the most recent drought, and 78% of the households are not affected by drought. We also found that this is drought is more primarily a rural phenomena, and Rayalaseema is the most affected region of the state of Andhra Pradesh, because 50% of the drought affected victims belongs to Rayalaseema region. And historically this has also been seen that this region, all the districts of this region are drought affected districts, followed by Telangana. Of course, poor are more vulnerable to drought. They are reported that they have experienced drought more than non-poor. And here I would like to mention that there are 3 socio-economic classes in India. The first class is other caste. We consider it other caste means the higher caste. The OBC is the middle in the strata, and the ST and the STs are in the lower section of the society. So we have found that about 55% of the drought victims belongs to the middle strata of the society, and SCs and STs are following the OBCs. Domestic animal, we tried to capture the domestic animals, whether the drought affected victims have domestic animals or not, because domestic animal is supposed to be one of the important assets during the event of drought, because at extreme drought, I have seen some of the literature also, during the extreme drought they used to sell at lower prices. So and secondly, we have also tried to see whether agriculture scientific agriculture, how the distribution is related to traditional agriculture and scientific agriculture. So we have scientific agriculture means those who are using improved seeds, those who are using farm tractors, and those who are using improved variety of manures. So we have found that 67% of the households are using scientific agriculture, so meaning that their input cost is more, and 32% are using traditional agriculture. Here almost all the drought victims in the right hand bar diagram, almost all the drought victims have received some kind of help from the government or from the NGO, food or monetary help, some kind of food or monetary help from the government or the NGO. This is the important drought diagram. This shows that about 1/3 of the whole drought victims are using credit, savings and insurances, and 21% of the drought victims are eating less, buying less and working more. That is their nutritional, this is related to their nutritional aspect. Again, 17% of the 17% of the households are migrating because of drought, because specific questions has been asked that whether you are migrating because of drought or some other factors. Then if the response is yes, they are migrating because of drought, then this has been considered as migrated because of drought. And 16% of the drought victims have received some help, some kind of help at least once during the event of drought. This is again the same. The Rayalaseema region, which is the most affected region, are using credit more, eating less, and migration distribution is also more. This is the distribution of according to caste group by different drought livelihood strategies. Here in the red bar is the OBCs, and they here in all the categories except for the eating and buying less, the SCs and STs are little 1% above the OBCs. This may be because OBCs are one of the most lower strata in the lower strata of the society, and they may not go for credit, or maybe the money lender may not found them the potential paying back of that money. So they are eating less and buying less and working more. Whether the household have domestic animals, we have found that almost all the households have domestic animals. Majority of households have domestic animal who are hit by drought, except those who have migrated to work. This is one of the important thing. According to that, NRHM is one of the important program run by Government of India, that is National Rural Health Mission. This program aims at least 100 days employment to the rural masses. So this is one of the important thing, because if they are employed by 100 days, their economic status will be improved, because otherwise they will be unemployed and migrated to urban areas. So we have found that majority of the drought victim in all categories, they are employed in NRHM, that is National Rural Health Mission. This is the logistic regression for model 1. In the model 1, only the use of saving, credit and insurances has been used as dependent variable. Here what is interesting to see is that Rayalaseema is the most important determining factor in comparison to coastal Andhra Pradesh, followed by household members who have more than 7 household members in the household. They are 2.09 times more likely to go for saving, credit and insurances. And here the caste groups like OBCs and SCs and STs are 0.85 times and 0.45 times less likely to go for saving, credit and insurances, because they are the lower strata of the society. They may not get the loan from the money lender. Here I have given only those variables which are statistically significant, and those variables which are not statistically, and those variables which are statistically not significant, I have not given here. This is this is logistic regression for the second model. Here eating less, buying less and working more is the dependent variable. We have found that SCs and STs are the most important, are 2.3 times more likely to go for eating less and buying less as compared to the other caste, which are the higher class. And all other variables, here again I have shown only those which are statistically significant. Again, Telangana and Rayalaseema regions are 1.4 times and 1.2 times more likely to go for eating and buying less compared to coastal Andhra Pradesh. This is some of the conclusions, that drought is in Andhra Pradesh is largely a rural phenomena, and Rayalaseema is the most affected region. Government help is available, some kind of government help at least once in a drought, but this is seems to be insufficient. 2/3 of the household practice scientific agriculture. That means their input cost is more for agriculture, and if drought hits, the most affected are those who have their input cost is more. So there are some of the policy implications that is coming out from the study is that EG loan can be made available for drought prone districts, and crop insurance may be provided to implement to improve the condition of the drought, though there is some program for crop implementation, but it is not universally implemented. And the third is that dietary supplement can be provided to drought affected victims, particularly those who belongs to the lower strata of the society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions, comments from the floor? Okay. Let's go.
Thank you very much. I tried to understand better these caste differences. So you said the OBC is sort of the middle ranging castes. But evidently they seem to be most affected by the droughts. Is this because they own land and the poorest castes don't have any land to do agriculture? Or what is the reason for this?
The most important reason is that they are the largest in, their population is the largest compared to those other two groups. So their share is more. And that is why the percentage is showing high for in all these categories.
So in relative terms, which one is most? So in relative terms, the lowest castes are more affected, huh?
Yeah, the lowest castes are more affected because they are socially as well as economically in the lower strata.
I'd like to hear more of your thoughts about the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, since that is so unusual worldwide to see a scheme of that size, which evidently, if I understood, is being utilized by members of the rural population. My understanding is that employment is specifically directed toward women, that they are encouraged, and so that you would think that together the 100 days, isn't it, of employment per year would be a substantial benefit. And yet, as you're saying, it doesn't seem to be enough. There's households are still seeking credit, they're still selling animals and so forth. Why is that?
This National Rural Health Mission has been made mandatory for the state government to implement in their respective states. But the time frame was not given that at what time you should implement universally this program at what time you should implement this program universally. So this program actually there is something called political affiliation. So those areas which are not hit by drought, it is a chunk of vote lies in those areas which are not hit by drought. So historically this has been those people are actually this National Rural Health Mission is targeted to give employment to all, not gender bias, targeted to all, both rural women as well as men, but only for 100 days. And we have found that there are several literature also that the 100 days of employment is not being given to all household members. Maybe 50 days, maybe 70 days, but not 100 days.
Yeah, this is a more a comment than a question. You mentioned the vicious circle of drought, and usually we don't talk about the drought as a vicious circle. You talk about environmental degradation as a vicious circle, and unless you have a good evidence that those kind of land degradation in certain area cause a high frequency of a drought. And of course, we have certain kind of, those kind of evidence from places like Amazon. But I don't know, when you're talking about vicious circle, do you have this kind of evidence from Indian setting?
Yeah, actually the slide that I showed, the vicious circle of drought, is actually this is in accordance with a report by by World Bank in 2010. They said that there is a sequence of event. Since the drought is the gap between one drought to another drought has reduced by around 1.5 years. So there is a sequence of events. First, that standing crop dies, then unemployment, and then reduction in household assets, then indebtedness, then eating less, nutritional aspect. That means there is a sequence of events that once this is finished, once the people are about to overcome these, the another drought hit. That is why this circle goes on.
Thank you for your talk. You're mainly focused on the household response to drought. But personally, I'm also interested in hearing more about how the government, the local community, and the household more positively responds to the drought. Given the fact that drought is a serious problem and you're talking about it become more frequent, First, I want to hear more about the reason why it become more frequent. And secondly, what the government, the community, and the household they have done to improve the situation to fight the drought. For example, invest or improve the irrigation system, etc. Given the fact that this meeting is about environment change, is about mitigation, about adaptation, I feel that kind of positive response is far more important.
Sir, there are a number of government programs, particularly related to storage of water. They have made at the district level, sometimes at the block level, they have made man-made reservoirs to collect whatever rains whatever rains comes. They have made reservoirs to collect it. But at the same time, actually this study is I wanted to explore what is their livelihood strategy and what are the socio-economic or demographic determinants for these livelihood strategies. But definitely I'll consider those your suggestion. I may include those, but definitely government programs are there. One of the important program is crop insurance. They have crop insurance, but that is the problem is that they have not universally implemented it.
Yes. The question about the use of percentages. Yeah, there's this number of about 10 slides showing these bar charts, which I think all of them in themselves are very interesting, and I'm actually looking forward to seeing those bar charts again after you would have changed percentages. Not so. Like the first question that was asked was like, why was the second caste most prominent among those drought-affected houses? And then the answer was like they were the largest group. But actually, I think if you redo all these bar charts showing for each of the three groups the percentage of households being drought-affected, then you actually get bar charts that really tell you something. And I would love to see the charts again after you have done that, because I think there might be some really interesting results there. Or maybe you can explain why you wanted to why you did it like that.
Actually, these three categories is upper caste, middle caste, and lower caste is very important. I wanted to see what is the distribution among all these three categories. That is why I did like that. But definitely your suggestion is very good. I would like to consider it and I would like to show separately for all three castes.
The same for comparing livestock owners, non-livestock owners. Like this whole series of charts have the same problem in my view.
I'd like to ask, you mentioned about scientific farming and traditional, was it?
Yes.
There were two categories. And from my experience in the Philippines, when you define scientific farming, is are these activities dependent on like more external inputs like fertilizers and pesticides, pest controls, and the others are not, I would assume? Because from our experience, the more the farmers are dependent on these inputs, the more they have to borrow money to finance, so that they become even more vulnerable to droughts, because when the crop failure happens, they are the ones who are solely responsible for the loss, and the financiers have no liability on that. So I'd like to know if there is that angle of vulnerability, added vulnerability to these people who are actually doing scientific farming because of more money that they borrow to plant.
Actually, this data says does not provide how much money do they borrow for scientific agriculture, but as I have found in some literature that scientific agriculture, that as you rightly said, that when people are practicing scientific agriculture, their input cost is more, and because of that they are more vulnerable to drought, because their standing crop dies during the event of drought. That is why only I used I tried to capture this scientific agriculture and tried to see how is the distribution of scientific agriculture when it comes to the event of drought, and I found that majority of the people are using scientific agriculture actually, and very few are using traditional agriculture. Is it right? I mean, is it satisfactory for you? Okay.
If not, we are moving to the third paper. Okay, Joan, Urquiola. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Is Joan Urquiola, a researcher in World Agroforestry Center, formerly known as International Center for Research in Agroforestry. I am also a graduate student in the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and actually what I'll be presenting is a part of my master's thesis, and it covers 60% of my initial results. So the title of my paper is Social Vulnerability to Climate Extremes at Northern Barangays of Puerto Princesa City, Philippines. My co-authors are, of course, my committee members, Dr. Leonardo M. Florece, Dr. Juan M. Pulhin, and Dr. Maria Victoria O. Espaldon of UPLB. Just to give a brief background, most of the early climate change studies focus more on the biophysical aspect of the environment, and hence little attention was given to the social dimension. This also holds true in the Philippines, wherein most of the early vulnerability assessment studies were looking into the physical characteristics like soil stability, forest cover, and other biophysical characteristics. But in the last few years, it was acknowledged that various individuals within a population will exhibit different degrees of vulnerabilities, and this paradigm shift gave rise to the concept of social vulnerability. And Philippines, as you heard from news and read from literature, is one of the developing countries which will experience most the adverse impacts of climate change. Actually, in literature, climate change manifestation in the Philippines include rise in temperature and changes in precipitation, such as increase in mean rainfall. And it was observed that in the last decade, there was an increase of 0.57 degrees Celsius in annual mean temperature. And although we are used to be visited by 19 to 20 typhoons a year, it was observed that there is an increasing intensity in the typhoons that we experienced. And apart from being exposed to these climate-related events, about half of the 90 million population of the Philippines are living in rural areas, and most of them are engaged in climate-sensitive livelihoods such as farming and fishing. And in literature, these sectors are in the front line that will be of the sectors that will be affected most by the changing climate. So having said that, it is very important to look into the socio-economic characteristics of these households. That's why in my study, I attempted to look into the vulnerability, the factors affecting the vulnerability of farming and fishing households. And the climate extremes that I've considered are El Nino and typhoon. This is my study site. It's located in the province of Palawan. And I have chosen 4 barangays or villages. And I've considered these barangays because it has a good proportion of farming and fishing households. So the area is characterized by having intact forest, and most of the communities are situated near the coastline. And for the sampling and survey, actually, prior to household survey, I conducted focus group discussions and key informant interview to check if the variables that I'll be using will be somehow applicable in the area, because there was no prior study about the socioeconomic variables that could affect the vulnerability of the households in this area. So I've included demographic and economic characteristics as well as livelihood assets, and I've used simple random sampling. For the farming households, I define farming households if the household, if the main source of the income of a household is farming, then they are considered as farming households. And if the main source of income is fishing, then I consider them as fishing households. So I was able to to sample 78.91% of the total population of farming households and 85.54% of the total population of fishing households. The same with the previous studies, I also considered using sustainable livelihood framework to, and I have used 5 capital assets: natural, physical, financial, social, and human. And for my study, I've used monthly production as the basis of vulnerability. So in formulating the vulnerability index, I've used logit regression. Instead of just asking them if they are vulnerable, I've used the difference in their monthly production during their remarkable El Nino and remarkable typhoon, and compared it with the current production. So if there is a decline in production, I've assigned 1 for them, which means they are vulnerable, and if not, 0. And so that serves as my dependent variable. And I've also used Tobit regression analysis to identify the factors affecting the current production of the farming and fishing households. Using the logit model, I've correlated the the odds ratio to some socioeconomic and demographic variables. For the factors affecting their current production, when I practiced my presentation last night, I realized that I wouldn't be able to discuss all the variables, so you can check my paper. And so I will focus more on the most significant variables. And interestingly, for the factors affecting the production of farming households, the most significant are number of dialect and if they are affiliated with the Baptist Church. And when I validated it on the ground, the farmers claim that if they have a higher number of dialect, if they could speak more dialect, they have higher chances to market their products as well as collaborate with other farmers in the area. And they will be able to share more information with their fellow farmers. And if they, and since my area is my study site is a rural area, they have these small churches, and they, for the Baptist Church, they personally, the members personally know each other, and somehow they share some common aspirations, so it would be easier for them to share resources and collaborate with each other. But I just validated it through interview the result of this regression. So I think I also need to look into literature that would support this claim. And for the factors affecting the production of fishing households, so this is more of physical capital and human capital, because the most significant variables are if their boat has a longer lifespan, if many laborers accompany them per trip, and if they could bear higher cost for, if they could pay more their laborers. And for the boat lifespan, it depicts that it is more likely to have higher production since they are characterized by higher durability, and it suggests that there is a lower chance for them to purchase another boat to maintain their production. And apart from maintenance costs, they could divert this fund to increasing other inputs of production. And if they have higher number of fishermen in a trip, of course, there is a higher labor force. And being able to pay more your laborers would mean higher labor tends to perform well if compensated properly. Now, let's proceed to the result of the logit regression. When I asked the participants of my FGD and my key informants, and through pre-testing of questionnaire, I asked them about their most remarkable El Nino in their area, and they said that it's 1994 to 1995. So what I did is I asked them about for the farmers, their production per cropping when there was an El Nino, and I've used their current profile to identify their present-day vulnerability. So if this El Nino happened to them right now, what are the significant factors that would either decrease or increase their vulnerability? And for the vulnerability to El Nino, the most significant factors are age in years, if they attained elementary level, and if they bring their patients to barangay health center, and their skills in flowing and cultivating. For the age in years, older farmers have wider experience and skills in farming, so it could decrease their vulnerability by 1.2%. Their chances of being vulnerable by 1.2%. And for the, if they reach, or if they only attain elementary level, that would tend to increase their vulnerability by, the chances of probability that they are vulnerable by 19%. Well, it's because of their limited economic opportunities and greater reliance on farming activities as means of their livelihood. And in terms of skills and flowing and cultivating, it could decrease their vulnerability, the chances that they would be vulnerable by 33.32%. It's because that they might increase their production even at the early stages of El Nino if they have that skill. Also, that would mean instead of increasing their cost by hiring someone to do the task for them, they could save the money and use it to increase other inputs. So using the logit model that I derived from the logistic regression, on the average, the odds ratio of farmers' vulnerability to El Nino is 0.40:1. So, and the correlation analysis revealed that age, sex, and length of residency are highly significant with the odds ratio of vulnerability to El Nino of each farming households. So you could check my paper for the explanation. And then next, for the vulnerability to El Nino of fishing households, the most significant factor is their perception if high temperature affects fish catch. So if they believe that, if the fishermen believe that high temperature affects their fish catch, that would result to 6.3% in chances of probability that the household will be vulnerable. I mean, that would decrease the chances that they would be vulnerable. It is because they could develop adaptation options to increase their production, even in hot season. And some of the adaptations options that they said were that they were fishing further from the coast during El Nino, and they are using net instead of hook and line, because some of the fishes because the water is very clear, so some of the fishes cannot be caught through hook and line. And they said that during El Nino, most of the fishes go further from the coast because it's hot. So most of the fishermen will fish further from the coast. So using the logit model, the mean odds ratio of fishing households' vulnerability to El Nino is 0.6 is to 1. So it is higher compared to farming households. Well, it is because of their adaptation strategy, since they need to spend more for fuel to go to further fishing ground, and of course because of higher input cost. And the correlation analysis revealed that demographic variables such as age and length of residency, educational attainment are significant to the odds ratio for vulnerability to El Nino of each fishing households. For the vulnerability to typhoon, the most remarkable typhoon in their area is Typhoon Fate, or we call it Typhoon Norming, in 1998. So actually, both the results for farming and fishing households show that a household size is highly significant. Well, it is because if they have a higher household size, then it tends to increase their vulnerability by 1.2%. It's because they need to spend more on their household expenses, and that would mean less budget for them to cope with for example, if their boats were struck by the typhoon, they wouldn't have enough money to repair the damaged equipments, because they need to spend more on their household expenses. And using the logit model, the odds ratio of farmers' vulnerability to typhoon is 0.4 is to 1. And household size, educational attainment, and age were found to be correlated with the odds ratio of vulnerability to typhoon. So the most significant factor for the vulnerability of fishing household to typhoon is also household size. But they have sorry for the typographical error, but fishing households have a higher odds ratio, and age, sex, and household size are correlated to the odds ratio for vulnerability to typhoon of each fishing households. So if you will compare the odds ratio of farming and fishing households to El Nino, and in terms of their vulnerability to El Nino and typhoon, fishing households have a higher odds ratio both for the two events. So I have a very general conclusion, since I'm still working on the analysis, and climate extremes negatively affect the production of farming and fishing households, hence increasing their level of vulnerability. Different specific demographic characteristics increases or decreases the vulnerability, and socio-economic characteristics contribute in terms of available resources and capacity to recover from impacts. Thank you so much. I hope you could help me enhance my analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have plenty of time for questions and comments. Okay, that's good. Questions? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. When you talk about the vulnerability to El Nino, and what kind of question you ask? Do the farmers and fishermen, they know El Nino, or you use different words or just explain what is El Nino? So this is a first question. And second, yeah, maybe because you due to time constraint, you kind of go very fast. I'm not very sure I understand you all the analysis you conducted. And one thing is that I'm not sure how you choose the variables, the independent variable, dependent variable. And for example, when you talk about the vulnerability of the fishermen to El Nino, and you use the variable like I believe that high temperature will affect fish catch. This is quite difficult if you want to use that variable as a independent variable to understand the vulnerability or the production. That's you don't know which one caused which, right? First, and second, I don't know if that's actually is a real the good variable you want to use in this analysis. Yeah, yeah, maybe you know you maybe I misunderstood you.
For the climate extremes, prior to asking them about the impact of climate extremes, I also asked them about what they understand about climate change, and some of their perception on climate extremes. But in my FGD and key informant interview, I talked with local government units and some of the knowledgeable people in the area. So they are already familiar with El Nino, and I also check it with the records if there is El Nino in that year. And in choosing the variables, I started with the Sustainable Livelihood Framework. So I conducted a literature review of the variables that could affect the vulnerability of households in terms of their livelihood, and then I presented it I presented it in the area through FGD and KAI, and asked them if they think that that would make sense. So, did I answer your question? Yes, we can talk later about it.
You were talking about El Nino, which refers to something related to Christmas, I think, and you had several variables in your regressions about religious affiliation. I saw Baptists and born-again Christians. And then you talked about fishermen, and Jesus was a fisherman, but you never, you didn't interpret these results. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on why you put in these variables, and also if there is a potential link between the religious affiliation and the other variable which I saw, which was fertility, I think. Two different Christian groups in your sample have different fertility rates, and does the religious affiliation also affect the vulnerability? Could you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
I included religion as part of the social capital. It's well, it's because it's one of their networks. So and in my result, and when I asked them, they tend to share more resources with, of course, the person they knew, the person they trust. But of course, I need to look on it on a deeper perspective. So I think I have to do more literature review and qualitative analysis to really support this claim. But thank you for that comment.
I was just curious. I could not really find it in the paper itself, but maybe you actually mentioned it. Why Palawan? Why this particular group of communities? Are they Did they exhibit some past vulnerability, or in the past? Why did you choose your study area?
Well, actually, they do not have a study on vulnerability. That's why I chose this site so that it could have a baseline study, and since the government is encouraging all the provinces to have this disaster risk management, I think it would be good to also look in Palawan, because in the previous years it is not that affected by climate change anomalies. So I think it's good to look at how the people perceive climate change in that area.
I'm going to go back to the El Nino questions, because I'm still not clear about, first, what are the specific events that are associated with El Nino in this area, and second, how many of these events you have in the period of study?
Actually, I was not able to ask them about how many events they had during that El Nino, but I think I have to look on it more carefully, because I just asked them what is the remarkable El Nino in the area. So I assume that they already understand what is El Nino, since they are the members of the focus group discussion are local government units and leaders of the POs and NGOs. So I assume that they already know about El Nino.
So let me clarify. So you did not look at the climate record to know where were the years of the Nino and the intensity of the El Nino, independently of what the focus groups or independently of what the interviewers told you? There is a climate record showing the frequency of El Nino for this area. Oh, okay, thank you.
Am I allowed to ask you questions? Okay, so if I remember correctly, you put number of dialects into your regression. I think it's quite nice. It's just another dimension of demography. But if I remember correctly, it increases farming production, right? But for El Nino, it actually increases vulnerability as well. So I'm trying to make sense, to make some sense of this results. And is it possible that people with different level of production kind of perceive define risk, or define how they are vulnerable differently? They have like kind of different relative level. That's why you see like people with more production related, like number of dialects increases production, farming production, but then they find themselves more vulnerable to El Nino. Is it because of they have a lot of like products to begin with? That's why. So I just try to make sense of the result, because to me it seems kind of contradicting.
Yes, actually I spent a lot of time thinking why the number of dialect is it increases the vulnerability during El Nino, and then intuitively I think of it as since since if you have a larger community circle or larger networks, it tends, the farmer has the tendency to share their resources. So, hence, although it is good for if you're looking at community vulnerability, since they would be able to cope, but for the household itself, sharing of resources would mean lesser input for their production. Yes, perhaps they.
More questions? All right, so we're done with this session. Thank you, everybody. So next we will have photo session.
As usual, it's going to be 20 minutes for the presentation, and then the rest of the time for questions. And I hope that we continue the very, very nice discussion that we have been having so far. So we're going to start with Charles Teller and Teshome Desta. They're going to present on migratory patterns and differential vulnerability as adaptation to drought.
Good late afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you're all awake because we're finally going to talk about migration. And we're all migrants, aren't we? Global migrants. It's actually a very complex topic, and it's not easy to measure, and what's one of the reasons that the DHS doesn't really measure it very well, and nor do the African censuses measure it well anymore. And we're hoping that it can be done. Let me just start out by saying my co-authors, we're very proud of our co-authors, we at Addis Ababa University. They are three of our best former students who are demographers and we call them they're ABDs. They're on the way to get their doctorates, but we need to actually find, or they need to find the right environment in which to get the funding for the PhD. And in fact, in a country like Ethiopia, now the national policy is to begin doctorate programs in country and pursue it. So to my left is Teshome Desta, who's in the demography program in the South at the Walaita Sodo University. Dula and Etana is now currently the acting head of our Center for Population Studies at Addis Ababa University. And Jordana Seifu is now in Europe in the EMER program on migration and development. And the important thing of having these three as co-authors is this is clearly the younger generation. This is the younger generation is being challenged by the so-called potential of the demographic dividend, but also there's quite a bit of skepticism in Africa about achieving the demographic dividend. And so what is the role of migration in helping to achieve this demographic dividend? The other important thing about the research that we do in Ethiopia, well, I've been doing research and teaching and advising there for almost 25 years, is it is such a big and complex country. And not only are there many tribes and languages and dialects and ecologies, but there are also a lot of different climatic zones, and climate is changing, but the variability of the climate and where you are at is so contextual that it's important that we have our students who come from these areas who know them, and they know, they and their elders, their parents and their grandparents, they know what it was like in the past, because this is the oral history, and what it's like presently. So Teshome is from the south in one of the most drought-prone areas, and he was involved in the research in the south. Dula is in from the west in the more forested area, and Jordanis is from the east and the north. And so it's important that when you're talking about context, if you have your colleagues who are from these areas and know how to do research and go back and study it, it can really be helpful. Well, okay. The country is, of course, you've probably all heard about the Great Famine of 1984-85. But even before that, throughout history. There were famines, but the country now is in really great transition. As a matter of fact, the World Bank considers us one of the rising stars in terms of economic growth in Africa. It's in a transition, well, from the kingdom of Haile Selassie to the communist dictatorship from the mid-70s to the early 90s, and now the last 20 years or so a mixed economy state. So that's a historic transition. In terms of the transitions that we scientifically are looking at, we've just written this book on the demographic transition in sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on Ethiopia. So there's been the demographic transition, the epidemiological transition, and we hope that there will be an emerging demographic dividend. But we're keen on really seeing the role of migration in all of this. Surprisingly, the World Bank does have some right to claim that Ethiopia is moving towards the middle-income country that it wants to be, although there's still a lot of poverty. But in terms of the MDG that we often are tracking, that is the hunger MDG and the undernutrition MDG, in fact, we're on track. But of course, 20 years ago, as it came out of communism into as it came out in the early 90s, the baseline for the MDGs was very, very, well, either high or low. But with this, there's still a lot of food insecurity, poverty, and functional illiteracy. We're also concerned about the population pressure. I mean, we've always been talked about population environment, but the growing fragmentation of the land and the landlessness. I won't go, because of the lack of time, I won't go into the fact that no one really owns the land, it's state-owned, and that has been a deterrent to migration. And also with the low technology and infrastructure, institutional capacity, there are really limited off-farm opportunities. What we have noticed is that the fact that the younger generation is increasingly migrating, but it's often not of the usual type that the census measures, which is permanent migration or duration of current residence, but it's often more impermanent types, temporary, circular, seasonal, even commuting types of migration. And there was an intercensal demographic survey done a year and a half ago, which shows that actually in some of the regions, unfortunately some of the regions that we have been studying, there's been high net out migration. There is a NAPA. Most countries do have their national adaptation strategies. There are about 37 potential climate change options there. None are demographic, and we're trying to work on that. It's also important to know that it's got 90 million people, and there's a growing youth bulge, and there are more than 25 million youth, and most of them, 85%, are in the rural areas. So that's kind of situation. Now, we want to make sure that you know that it's not just we're reading the global literature, but there's a lot been done because of this, particularly the droughts of the 70 and 80, and the fact that several million died in the famine in the mid-80s. There's been quite a bit done, not only in our university, but other universities and research. So this gives you a sense of what we have learned by actually doing. So the objective here, again, is to look at this growing the complexity of these different patterns of migration in the different contexts and actually the different climatic zones of Ethiopia. But we're looking at most of us are social scientists, so we're looking at the potential of migration as a driver of development, but through certain pathways. Education being extremely important, not only jobs and off-farm employment, but also education. But we're also finding there's this ideational change and the what we call agency, the motivation, the strong motivation of youth to not suffer like their parents have, not be barefooted and hungry down on the farm, but to move around and search their destiny. So our focus is on rural youth. A lot of our students are rural youth, and we know that they are increasingly wanting to move forward. But there are tremendous constraints to moving forward. So we have a number of research questions here in having to do with the demographic vulnerability, the usual types of migration issues the demographers and social scientists look at as to the risks, the consequences, and the opportunities when they have a balance of the risks and the opportunities. I think there's a lot of focus in the press in Africa on the risks, and we know boats do go down and migrants do suffocate, but what is not recognized is all the opportunities too. Thirdly, while we haven't had much mention of it at all here, Teshome did his thesis on irregular and international migration from a certain area in the south to South Africa, and the fact that a lot of them are staying there and not returning. Some do return. We want to see what the role is of international migration in the youth development and the demographic dividend. And finally, as part of these transitions, we're looking at migration and urbanization as part of contributing to the demographic dividend. And we've already seen and published in other papers how it contributes to delayed transition to marriage and to lower fertility. Again, being contextual, we're going to focus on kind of 4 different agroclimatic zones in the country. There will be some maps. One of them, well, let me go to them. Can you want to point to them? So the first one in the northwest is Gojam. Then in the middle is west is Arjo, and then down towards the south, Hadia, Kambata, and Walaita. So in one of the 4 is clearly drought prone. It's the classic drought prone area of Walaita, very rugged along the Omo River. The second one in the northwest is quite different. It's very mountainous, densely populated, and has become deforested. It's along the tributary of the White Nile. The third is in the south center, very densely populated, probably over 1,000 people per square kilometer. And the fourth one is in that southwest. It's more forested and subsistence agriculture and quite isolated. So we want to just be sure that I don't see any other Africans here, but that it's wrong to generalize about Africa. But also, when you get to the Horn of Africa, and then when you get to Ethiopia, it's also beware of the gross generalization. But there are certain cross-cutting patterns that we can see. These are the different densities. Here you can see in the south, there in the south, the very extreme densities. The Rift Valley, can show them the Rift Valley, kind of cuts on the continental divide. Those are the high densities, but also in the northwest along the Nile basin, you have high densities. So the first 2 case studies, we actually got some funding to look explicitly at coping and adaptation to shocks and hazard. It was mainly because, matter of fact, the Population Council and Packard Foundation, with a lot of projects with youth, were finding that they were being trained today and gone tomorrow. And that was one of the real concerns that they had. So obviously we had to do the both the did quantitative, but this is the qualitative studies with the teen girls. So the first thing is, again, we say how hard it is to actually measure migration, to define it, and particularly the three common patterns of migration, which is the blue on the left is the short term or seasonal. The one on the right, the gray, is the permanent, and this is permanent based on intention to stay away, to be permanent. And then third is in order to be predictive, the planning. So you can see on the, is it to your right? Yeah, on your right, that's the Walaita, the drought-prone Wareda, and all three patterns have a higher percentage of households with those three types of migrants. So again, the drought-prone, and it's not that they are the more accessible, but they are the most drought-prone and poverty-prone. We've been asked to look at the demographic differential vulnerabilities, and we found here and in other areas that looking at the heads of household, both the age of the head of household and also the sex of head of household is important. I won't go into a lot of the multivariate analysis, but when you look at the socio-economic and demographic correlates, we did find that, as in probably a lot of other demographic literature, the permanent migrants are selective. They're better off, and those who are intending to migrate in the next year are. The temporary migrants, where you see the shocks and the risks faced in the middle column, they had the highest documented reaction to shocks and risks faced. Now, we also looked at the patterns in the 80s and 90s. Predominantly, the migration patterns were rural. Not only girls, not only for marriage, but also for off-farm labor. But that's turned around now, and to these two important out-migration regions, about 80%, 86% from Walaita and 79% from Gojam are rural-urban permanent patterns. Also, they are descending households have a greater level of assets, okay, than the non-migrant, and you can see that fairly clearly. Now, this is important for IASA, and they also are advocating education is important in development. We found that we were actually quite surprised to find, if you can see the red bars, that the if you're comparing the work-related reasons for migrating versus the study-related, from at least the Northwest, Gojam, that was the number. It was much more important, the study-related reasons for migrating than the work-related. But if you go to the more impoverished, drought-prone Southwest, Walaita, it was what we expected, the work-related. This is also very important in terms of the secondary transition, that once they migrated, that's it, in West Gojam, once they migrated, they did get a lot more higher education. So like in West Gojam, 21% migrated that were in high school or had a high school education, but at the time of the survey, which may have averaged up to 10 years, 2/3 had a high school and above education. Where you look at Walaita, there was almost no increase, say from 16 to 21% with higher education. Now, in terms of when we asked explicitly, and you can go into the paper and look at this methodology, it's a similar methodology that the World Bank has been using in the African adaptation project. See, if they were if there are different types of shocks and hazard, was anything done? And if anything was done about it, what was done short-term and what was done long-term? Short-term coping and long-term adaptation. And we found that, well, migration wasn't the number one coping or particularly adaptation strategy, it was number two. So migration off-farm labor. And what we have is that 22% of the adaptation responses to all shocks were using migration off-farm, but to specifically environmental shocks, it was 11%. So about a quarter are using migration for adaptation. So it's the decision-making process is very complex, and that's also why we use not only the qualitative research, but our colleagues, our students from these areas. I won't go into the complexity. We have a lot of quotes, how it's perceived, you know, that the kids don't want to wait anymore for the needs to be fulfilled, since they observe that their parents can't do it. Then we try to again weigh the benefits and the risks, and there certainly are risks involved, but overall the benefits in let's say in the deforested West Gojam were somewhat different from the drought-prone Walaita, but there's still more benefits than risks. Here's a quote on the importance of seasonal migration to save so they can continue in school. Then the case 3 is Arjo. I'm not going to go into it, but it's non-drought prone. But what's really important is it's rather isolated. And if you look down here, that the last bullet, very weak rural-urban linkages and external social networks. It's also a conservative culture, and it's stigmatized. We found out in a number of our students who go back and do their migration, they're finding low levels of migration, but it's because the parents aren't admitting that their kids are migrating. It's highly stigmatized. Also in this drought-prone area, the non-drought-prone area, the demographic vulnerability in extreme age is in the extreme ages of the household head, the young and the quite old. And finally, Teshome's recent research on irregular international migration. These are the patterns from Ethiopia to South Africa, and we're seeing, and you want to point to it, that in terms of the OM, the high 68% had a secondary education before they migrated, whereas the non-migrants and the return migrants had less education. Also, the outmigrants international were tended to be disproportionately employed before they left, 66%, and the others were less employed. In terms of the causes, it's kind of balanced, the push and the pull. Obviously, there's a lot of pull. The word is out. You do well in South Africa, and Ethiopians do well. But also, there are quite a bit of pull factors. In this quote that Teshome got, for us, next to God is only South Africa. That's how they hold it in quite an esteem. So finally, on the discussion, well, let's see. That education is a main benefit of outmigration in the better off districts, and especially for the girls, and that's really important for continuing the demographic transition and the dividend. But also, better off youth in one of the non-drought-prone areas were less likely to migrate permanently because it was culturally unacceptable to leave, and they have other options. So that's the context. So our conclusion here is in terms of adaptation to climate variability in the context of socio-cultural and political change, there are more opportunities than risks. It is contributing to the potential demographic dividend. These shocks do affect more of the poor short-term migrants but not the long-term migrants. So that's more of a development-oriented. This overseas migration, this has to be dealt with. It's not only Ethiopia. You know, it's a big issue. We have to deal with it. But the perception of better opportunities is actually a reality, not just a perception. And the networks that these youth have, they know what's going on, and they're really willing to lead. So finally, with a lot of policy implications, we at Addis Ababa University are highly involved in recommending policy. But clearly, we want to, number one, that top line, to generate a national debate. Migration is just seen as so detrimental. It's so bad. The population policy says stop it. But on the other hand, if you want the demographic dividend, you better think otherwise. We are also, though, concerned towards the bottom about what we could consider the trapped youth that are trying to eke out or potentially a living and get married on eroded 1/2 of a hectare on their parents' land, and they're the ones that got to deal with because the benefits are not so good for them. Finally, the acknowledgements. Obviously, we did at least the economic side with the Ethiopian Economic Association. They're some of the best economists in the country. They work also with the World Bank. At Addis Ababa University, I also am at George Washington University. He's at Soto. And here's Raya over here, who's been encouraging us to present this and is supporting what are some of our most promising graduate students. So thank you.
Okay, we have now 10 minutes for the questions. There's a question over here.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Charles. Very interesting results. I particularly liked the policy orientation of the paper and the policy conclusions that you draw, especially with regard to the need for a national debate and for viewing adaptation as a way to maximize also the demographic dividends. We have a research project that also discusses Ethiopia that will be presented just after your paper, and I was offering that maybe if you're interested to go in this direction, we could possibly try to join forces to try to organize an event with the Ethiopian government, something of a round table, to make them view the benefits of migration and how national policies should be adapted in this regard. I very much agree with you that governments usually are stuck in what I would call the paradigm of immobility. That is, they consider that their role is to avoid migration, whereas especially in this situation, especially for youth, as you've mentioned, it is, I believe it is extremely important in the context of climate change to actually facilitate and encourage migration. So this is an offer of service and something that I'd be happy to discuss with you later on.
I just want to say that one has to be careful not to immediately go to the government. They have a certain way of thinking. But this dialogue, what we normally do on another issue, for example, on the discrepancies in our mortality estimates between what the DHS was saying and what the Ministry of Health was saying, huge discrepancies. You have to discuss it mainly in a technical forum first with, but particularly high-level technical people, and then build up that type of trust. What is important, though, is that the National University, Addis Ababa University, being the government university, there is a certain amount of trust in there. On the other hand, our research has shown that demographic issues are quite sensitive. It's not only migration, international migration, it's it's other issues of the balance of power between the different ethnic groups in the different regions. And so when one region has been found to have actually tremendously lowered their fertility, they were really unhappy with that because now they're going to not be able to compete with the other regions.
Thank you. So if you have a look at the literature on development economics, you tend to find a lot of evidence that kinship structures tend to act as tend to have a negative effect on investment, right? You have this idea that you have an insurance mechanism that basically acts as a disincentive to accumulate wealth since the property rights are not clearly established. Now, did I read it properly from the presentation that kinship structures, you call them conservative social structures, are also acting as a disincentive for the accumulation of human capital in this case?
Right.
So it's like a double negative dividend from kinship, which probably would fit very well to many of the results that we find in the empirical development economics literature.
Teshome, you want to say something about the kinship?
Kinship.
Hadia?
Yeah, of course. Towards the international migration from South Ethiopia to South Africa, yeah, the role of kinship and network is very important than environmental reasons. So I think one of the slides show this one. So about 44% of the migrants and people there think that the main reason for outmigration is just perceived better opportunities there in South Africa. So the role of kinship and family relationship is very important in this pattern of migration.
Let me just add one thing on kinship being a somewhat outsider, insider. Probably the most successful ethnic group economically in Ethiopia have been the Gurage. Okay. Traditionally, all boys before they're 10 migrate. They migrate from the central south to Addis Ababa, but they migrate with a shoebox or a shoe shine box or with some investment. And they do go back, the males every New Year, and each time they go back, they're doing that. So if the kinship has been supportive of this entrepreneurship, that's important. Now they're becoming so successful that they're not going into shoe shining anymore, but the Walaita are going into the shoe shining. Unfortunately, when it gets going, then those networks will be supportive. But there are other cultures that are quite traditional, and it's really hard to generalize that one might be conservative and one might be entrepreneurial. I think that increasingly, though, the youth know that they need to strike out. There's the so-called agency that we've been studying. Also, Brown and other universities have been studying this phenomenon of agency, of high motivation, and feeding in. So once you actually get into high school, it's almost impossible, at least in the north, to go back to the farm. You're considered, you moved on. But in some areas like this Arjo area, it's not, that your parents do want them to come back. So that's why we do have anthropologists involved, try to figure out the kinships which are positive and which are network. What we do find out, though, it's protective of the girls. The girls, when they migrate, the younger girls, the 12 to 15, they need to have the protection of the kinship.
No more questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
The way population reacted to these changes, controlling for other variables and for other changes, and try to project that in the future. And here, a key mistake that we should avoid would be to think that climate change will be the only transformation forces on societies. Of course, by the time we will reach +4 or +6 degrees, other changes will have happened, demographic changes, economic changes, political changes. We will need to control for these variables, and we believe it is only through the combination of different methods and different case studies that we will be able to project some plausible scenarios in that regard. But we certainly do not want to undermine the challenge and the methodological challenge that it represents, which is also the reason why it was important for us to present the methodology at the very start of this project in this kind of setting.
Thank you. Just to follow up on your last words, maybe just a suggestion that this is precisely the purpose while these SSPs, these shared socioeconomic pathways, were developed to have alternative scenarios of how not just the climate changes, but how human populations change and how their socioeconomic capacity to deal both with the mitigation and the adaptation challenges. And they exist now for all countries in the world, and they will be further defined on sub-national level. So, I mean, and this has been the main topic of my own ERC project, which is now ending on how to anticipate, how to forecast future adaptive capacity. So maybe there should be more collaboration on these topics around the table. My question still is more of a linguistic one. I'm happy that people these days hardly speak anymore of environmental refugees, because this is really a misnomer. But I've still heard the notion of displaced people. Now, what constitutes a displaced person from someone who is more or less a voluntary migrant? Like the Moroccans who come to work in the Spanish agriculture, or the Mexicans who move to the US. Would you call them displaced people? I mean, they live in northern Mexico in an arid area with high population growth, little economic opportunities. Well, they are displaced by poverty, if you want, or attracted by the better economic opportunities. So, sort of, can you talk a little bit, what is your definition of a displaced person?
Yes, I have two related questions. One, we mentioned in our presentation that the international migration is becoming a greater issue. So I'm just wondering, in these these numerous countries that you're talking about, are you considering the impact of the warming on the international migration? And a related question, having also to do with, you might say, politics. I mean, you mentioned the political drivers of migration, and there are numerous, I think, political drivers, but I wonder if you could be a little more explicit as to what they are. For example, in a country like Ethiopia, you cannot migrate from one ethnic zone to another ethnic zone. You cannot. So you're going to be dealing with agro-pastoralists. Okay, they traditionally have been migrating across different ethnic zones, but now they cannot. So, or the Somalis going between Somalia and the Agadan. So I'm just wondering, what are these different political drivers you're going to be considering, and do they have international repercussions?
I just want to follow the discussion on also the question Wolfgang raised. And I guess you have a climate model, right? And which produce 2 degree, 4 degree, and 6 degree.
We don't, but climate scientists do.
Which one?
We don't do it ourselves. Climate scientists do, and we work with climate scientists on that.
There's different work packages.
Which model then you use for that projection? Do you know that?
Yes.
What is okay, so we can talk about this. And the question is, as Wolfgang mentioned that, you also correctly mentioned that in the future the population will be different population, and the society will be different society. And it will be ideal to integrate into say certain things like socio-economic pathways. But then the question is, so far there is no model, climate model, who adopt the SSPs yet. Mm-hmm. And if it's possible, then the climate models, modelers who use the SSPs into their projection for the futures, and of course that even I'm from Ankara, we have a CSM model, the largest climate model in the world, and what we are trying to do is take the first step, and still it's a far way to produce that kind of integrated socio-economic and climate system, integrated projections. And I don't know what the status of your work and what is the kind of a time frame that you have to produce such a kind of a product.
Start with displacement and migration.
Then actually by displaced people, we mostly, we are talking about forced migration, and actually I think we were quite, we were paying quite attention to this kind of words because, we talk most of the time more about migrants and displaced people, which actually is, we used more when I was presenting, for example, the data, all these predictions, and where the people, they talk about displaced people again and again, and always is the idea of forced migration. And it's also one of the bias, is that actually we never know exactly if they talk about voluntary or forced people. They always talk about displaced people, but just do they talk about really the forced people, or also about people who has decided to move for some reasons and also environmental reasons?
But again, in complement to that, I believe that it is also useful, even though we have this traditional distinction between the migration assumed to be voluntary and displacement which is assumed to be forced, to question basically where you draw the line, especially in the context of climate change, between the forced and the voluntary components. And I guess that, especially in the context of climate change, we have to take into account the fact that all migration movement as a forced component, as a voluntary component. So this discussion on the terms and the vocables is I wouldn't say is a never-ending discussion, but certainly warrants more discussion, especially in that context about where you draw the line between voluntary and forced migration. Coming to the political drivers of migration, well, that's a broad, wide-encompassing term, but by that I would say that we apprehend all policies implemented by the state or by local authorities that will have an impact on migration. That is, migration policies such as the one you mentioned in Ethiopia, and other countries have similar policies. But also mitigation and adaptation policies. You mentioned in your presentation the importance of including migration in the national action plans for adaptation. This is also one of the political drivers of migration that we will look into, and increasingly in the context of climate change, migration is also becoming an environmental policy. So we'll be looking not only at migration policies, but also at environmental policies. Now with regard to the climate model, so in the project we work with a lot of climate modelers. Actually, most of the participants of the projects are climate modelers. We're the only social scientists, so to say, in the project. And an initial joke that my colleagues, climate modelers, were making at the start of the project were to say, well, we're going to provide you with new climate data at +4 and +6 degrees, so then you can input these data in your migration models and figure out how many people will migrate. And of course, it doesn't work like that. So we, without going into too many technicalities, we work mostly with 4 teams of climate modelers at the University of Exeter and the Met Office, at the Tyndall Center at the University of East Anglia, with the CNRS and Institut Pierre-Simon Laplace in France, and finally with the PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research in Germany. They work with a combination of different climate models. One of them is the CSM model, which is a central component. But there are other models such as Orchidea, which are brought into to illustrate some specific assets, some specific impacts of climate change, for example, impacts on the vegetation. And they're also in the process of developing new climate models specifically tailored for the +4 and +6 degree scenarios. As you rightly said, none of these models integrate socio-economic pathways. That's in the process of being developed by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Seville. They're trying to build a model that would integrate climate variables and socio-economic variables into that model. And of course, one step further would be to add the migration component, but that's a whole other methodological challenge.
When you say include the migration component, what exactly are you talking about?
That's difficult to say. Our colleagues at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission integrate climate models with socioeconomic variables, which is basically evolution of the job markets, evolution of economic growth. And they're asking us, how could we integrate migration into this model? So far, we don't have an answer to this question.
Okay, great.
That's all the time we have. I think that this is the last session of today. I'm not sure how we follow after this. Right.
Well, first of all, thank you for all the excellent session, the presenters, the chairs, and the audience. We are having dinner at 7 at the beach side, so the restaurant is at the beach side. Unfortunately, we cannot cover beverages, soft drink, juice, nor alcoholic drink. It's a university policy that we cannot, but water is included. It's all free. And there's plenty of food. It's a barbecue, seafood, and it's a buffet. So please join us. Thank you.